Some moments arrive like thunder in a quiet sky, unexpected and impossible to ignore. For Natalie Harper, that moment walked through the brass-trimmed doors of La Maison Bleue on a rain-soaked Friday evening, dressed in a Tom Ford suit and carrying the weight of their shared history in his steel-gray eyes. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind to where it all began, 3 years ago when a brilliant architect met a self-made billionaire and discovered that building walls around your heart doesn't make them any less likely to crumble. Natalie Harper was everything her mother had warned her not to be. At 28, she'd traded the security of a corporate architecture firm for the terrifying freedom of her own design studio in downtown Seattle. Her portfolio featured sustainable homes that blended seamlessly with their natural surroundings, structures that breathed with the land rather than dominating it. She wore vintage blazers over band t-shirts, sketched building designs on coffee shop napkins, and believed that beauty and function were inseparable twins. Her auburn curls were usually twisted into a messy bun held together by a pencil, and her hazel eyes held the focused intensity of someone who saw the world in blueprints and possibilities. Tonight, however, those curls were styled in soft waves that brushed her shoulders, and she'd traded her usual jeans for a fitted emerald dress that matched her eyes. Across from her sat Daniel Cho, a charming software developer she'd met at a gallery opening 2 weeks ago. He had kind eyes, an easy laugh, and absolutely no idea that Natalie's attention kept drifting to her phone, checking messages she hoped wouldn't come. "You seem distracted," Daniel said gently, setting down his wine glass with a slight smile that held no accusation. "Second thoughts about dinner?" Natalie felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. Daniel didn't deserve her preoccupation. Didn't deserve to compete with ghosts she'd been trying to bury for 6 months. "I'm sorry. Work has been intense lately. We're pitching for the Greenwood Plaza project next week, the sustainable housing development on the waterfront." Daniel's face lit with genuine interest. "That's incredible, Natalie. I heard they're only considering 3 firms for the entire design. 2, actually. My studio and Bennett Architecture." She tried to sound casual about it, but her fingers tightened slightly around her fork. Bennett Architecture was the firm she'd left 3 years ago, the place where she'd learned everything she knew about designing structures that honored the earth instead of conquering it. It was also where she'd met Christian Bennett. "You'll get it," Daniel said with the confidence of someone who hadn't watched their dreams crumble in real time. "Your work is phenomenal. I looked at your website after we met, and those cliffside homes you designed in Oregon, they're like something out of a dream." Natalie smiled, genuinely touched by his enthusiasm. Daniel was safe, uncomplicated, exactly the kind of man her best friend Sophie kept telling her she needed. No drama, no power games, just a normal guy with a stable job and healthy communication skills. So why did her heart feel like it was going through the motions instead of genuinely engaging? The restaurant hummed with Friday night energy. Soft jazz played over speakers hidden in the exposed brick walls, and candlelight flickered across white tablecloths, creating an atmosphere of intimate elegance. La Maison Bleue was the kind of place where Seattle's elite came to see and be seen, where business deals were sealed over perfectly prepared duck confit, and relationships were defined over shared creme brulee. Natalie was explaining her vision for incorporating living walls into urban architecture when she felt it, that prickle of awareness that ran down her spine like ice water, the sensation of being watched by eyes that knew every one of her tells and vulnerabilities. Her words faltered mid-sentence as she glanced toward the entrance. Christian Bennett stood in the doorway, rain droplets catching the light on his broad shoulders, his dark hair slightly mussed from the weather outside. At 35, he'd grown more distinguished rather than older, the slight silver at his temples only adding to the aura of power that surrounded him like an expensive cologne. His gray eyes swept the restaurant with the casual confidence of a man who owned buildings in 6 countries and had never heard the word no that he couldn't eventually turn into yes. Then those eyes found her. Natalie's breath caught in her throat. 6 months. It had been 6 months since she'd seen him, since that devastating conversation in his office where everything they'd built together had collapsed like a poorly designed foundation. 6 months since she'd walked away from both the man and the company that had defined her adult life. Time seemed to slow as Christian's gaze locked onto hers. She saw surprise flicker across his features, followed by something darker and more complicated. Possession, maybe, or regret, or that dangerous combination of both that had always defined their relationship. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his hands clenched briefly at his sides before he forced them to relax. He wasn't alone. A woman appeared beside him, stunning in the way that only extreme wealth and professional styling could achieve. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves that probably cost more than Natalie's monthly studio rent, and her black cocktail dress hugged a figure that suggested both personal trainers and disciplined eating habits. She touched Christian's arm with casual familiarity, leaning in to whisper something that made him nod without taking his eyes off Natalie. Natalie? Daniel's concerned voice broke through the fog of shock and unwanted emotion flooding her system. Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Not a ghost, Natalie managed, forcing her voice to remain steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Just someone I used to know. But Daniel was already following her gaze, his expression shifting from concern to understanding, as he took in Christian's commanding presence and the way the man was staring at Natalie, with an intensity that made their connection obvious to anyone watching. Used to know or used to be involved with? Natalie appreciated his directness, his refusal to pretend he didn't see what was happening. Both. It ended 6 months ago. And judging by the way he's looking at you, he's not particularly happy about that ending. Daniel's tone held no jealousy, just observation tinged with resignation. Christian was moving now, cutting through the restaurant with the purposeful stride of a man who'd spotted something that belonged to him. The blonde followed in his wake, her perfect features arranging themselves into practiced curiosity as she tried to understand what had captured his attention so completely, Mr. Bennett. The maitre d' approached with the deference reserved for regular customers who tipped in hundreds rather than tens. Your usual table is ready. Actually, Francois, Christian said, his deep voice carrying just enough to reach Natalie's ears. I see some acquaintances I'd like to greet first. He was at their table before Natalie could prepare herself, before she could arrange her features into the mask of indifference she'd practiced in front of her bathroom mirror for weeks after their breakup. Up close, he was even more devastating than memory had preserved. She could smell his cologne, see the slight tension in his jaw that meant he was fighting to maintain control. Natalie. Her name on his lips was a prayer and an accusation. I didn't expect to see you here. Seattle's a big city, Christian. We were bound to run into each other eventually. Her voice came out cooler than she felt, which she counted as a minor victory. Christian's eyes flicked to Daniel with barely concealed assessment, taking in the software developer's open, honest face and the casual way his hand rested near Natalie's on the table. Something dangerous flickered in Christian's expression, quickly masked but not quickly enough. I don't believe we've met. Daniel extended his hand with admirable composure, apparently unbothered by the billionaire looming over their table, radiating barely suppressed intensity. Daniel Cho. Christian's handshake was probably firmer than necessary. Christian Bennett. I own Bennett Architecture where Natalie used to work. The emphasis on used to wasn't lost on anyone at the table. Christian. The blonde had materialized beside him, her manicured hand sliding possessively around his arm. Darling, you're being rude. Aren't you going to introduce me? Christian's jaw tightened fractionally before his professional mask slid back into place. Of course. This is Victoria Ashford, a consultant working on the Evergreen Tower project. He gestured to Natalie. Victoria, this is Natalie Harper, one of the most talented architects I've ever worked with. The past tense hit Natalie like a physical blow, even though she'd been the one to leave. Victoria's smile was polite, but her eyes assessed Natalie with the calculation of a woman who recognized potential competition and was already planning her defensive strategy. Lovely to meet you, Victoria said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. Christian speaks so highly of his former employees. Former employees, not former partner, not the woman who'd spent 3 years designing groundbreaking, sustainable structures while falling hopelessly in love with a man who viewed emotion as weakness and vulnerability as a liability. We should let them get back to their dinner, Natalie said, proud of how steady her voice remained. I'm sure Francois has your table ready. Christian didn't move. His eyes were locked on Natalie's face with an intensity that made her feel naked, seen in ways she'd forgotten were possible. I heard you're competing for the Greenwood Plaza project. That's ambitious for such a new firm. There was no condescension in his tone, just a statement of fact that somehow felt more insulting than if he'd been overtly dismissive. Natalie felt her spine straighten, her chin lift with the stubborn pride that had gotten her through architecture school and the aftermath of their relationship. Some of us don't need the security of an established name to do excellent work, she said sweetly. Innovation tends to come from those willing to take risks, not those hiding behind reputation. A ghost of a smile touched Christian's lips, the first genuine expression she'd seen since he'd walked through the door. He'd always loved when she challenged him, when she refused to be intimidated by his success or his presence. It was one of the things that had drawn them together in the first place, her refusal to treat him like a god among mortals. Still fighting for what you believe in, he said quietly, his voice dropping to that intimate register that used to make her knees weak. Some things never change, and some things change completely. Natalie held his gaze, refusing to look away first, even though her heart was racing. People grow. They move on. They build new lives with people who actually know how to be present in a relationship. The barb hit its target. She saw Christian flinch almost imperceptibly, saw the flash of pain he couldn't quite hide behind his controlled exterior. Victoria's grip on his arm tightened, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drawing together as she sensed the undercurrents swirling around the table. "We really should go," Victoria said firmly, tugging Christian's arm with more force than was strictly polite. "Our reservation, remember?" Christian allowed himself to be pulled away, but not before his eyes locked with Natalie's one more time. In that look, she saw everything they'd been and everything they'd lost. The late nights designing buildings that would change city skylines. The stolen kisses in his office when everyone else had gone home. The way he'd traced the lines of her sketches with reverent fingers before tracing the same patterns on her skin. The devastating moment when she'd realized he would never love her more than he loved his control, his empire, his carefully constructed walls. "It was good to see you, Natalie," he said, his voice rough with emotions he'd never learned to express. Then he was gone, following Victoria to a corner table where he sat with his back to Natalie, but his attention obviously still focused on her presence in the room. Daniel exhaled slowly, picking up his wine glass with a slight smile that held unexpected understanding. "So that's Christian Bennett. I've read about him in the business journals. Brilliant architect, revolutionary sustainable design philosophy, reputation for being utterly ruthless in negotiations. That about covers it." Natalie tried to focus on her plate, but her appetite had vanished along with her composure. "And you were together for how long?" 3 years. We tried to keep it professional at first, but working that closely with someone, creating things together, it blurred every line we tried to draw. Natalie took a sip of wine, buying herself a moment to organize thoughts that felt scattered like loose blueprints in a windstorm. "I thought we wanted the same things. Partnership, growth, building something meaningful together. Turns out he wanted control and I wanted connection. Those things don't coexist well." Daniel nodded slowly, his kind eyes reflecting sympathy without pity. "And now you're competing for the same project. Welcome to my complicated life." Natalie managed a wry smile. "Still interested in dessert, or has my ex-boyfriend drama scared you off?" "I'm thinking maybe we should reschedule," Daniel said gently, pulling out his wallet to signal for the check. "Not because I'm scared off, but because you deserve a date where you're actually present, not reliving your past across the room." Natalie could have kissed him for his kindness, for seeing through her attempted normalcy to the turmoil underneath. "I'm sorry, Daniel. You deserve better than this. Everyone deserves better than half attention." He smiled as he stood, helping her with her chair like his mother had obviously raised him right. "But for what it's worth, Natalie, I hope you get that project. And I hope seeing him again reminds you why you left instead of why you stayed." They made their way to the exit, Natalie hyper-aware of Christian's presence burning into her back even though she refused to turn around. The rain had intensified while they'd been inside, turning Seattle streets into rivers of light and motion. Daniel offered to walk her to her car, but she politely declined, needing the solitude to process everything that had just happened. She was unlocking her car door when she heard his voice behind her. "Running away again, Natalie?" She turned to find Christian standing in the rain, his expensive suit getting soaked but his attention entirely focused on her face. Victoria was nowhere to be seen, probably waiting inside where civilized people stayed dry. "I'm not running. I'm leaving." "There's a difference." "Is there?" He stepped closer, rain streaming down his face but his eyes holding that familiar intensity that used to make her feel like the only person in his world. Because 6 months ago you ran out of my office without giving me a chance to explain. There was nothing to explain. Natalie felt old wounds threatening to reopen. You made your priorities clear, Christian. The company comes first. Control comes first. Your perfectly managed empire comes first. I was just supposed to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you decided to throw my way. That's not fair. Fair? Natalie laughed, the sound bitter even to her own ears. You want to talk about fair? I gave you 3 years, Christian. 3 years of supporting your vision, designing buildings that won you awards, working 80-hour weeks to make Bennett Architecture the most innovative firm in the Pacific Northwest. And when I asked for one thing, just one thing, you couldn't give it to me. You asked me to choose between you and my company. Christian's voice was tight with the same frustration she remembered from their final fight. That's not a fair request, Natalie. I asked you to make space for me in your life beyond the office. Natalie stepped closer, not caring that rain was ruining her carefully styled hair. I asked you to be vulnerable, to let me in, to stop treating our relationship like another business transaction that needed to be managed and controlled. That's not the same as asking you to choose. They stood in the rain-soaked parking lot, years of unspoken pain and unmet needs finally spilling out like the water streaming around their feet. Christian's hands clenched at his sides as if he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her. I didn't know how, he said finally, his voice so quiet she almost missed it over the sound of rain hitting metal and pavement. I didn't know how to be what you needed. You never tried to learn. Natalie felt tears mixing with rainwater on her cheeks. That was the problem, Christian. You built empires, but you couldn't build a bridge between your heart and mine. And now? His eyes searched her face with desperate intensity. Now you're building that bridge with him? The software developer with the kind eyes and the safe job? Daniel has nothing to do with this, doesn't he? Christian took another step closer, close enough now that she could see the rain droplets caught in his dark lashes. You're trying to replace what we had with something easier, something that doesn't challenge you or push you or make you feel like you're standing on the edge of something terrifying and beautiful. What we had destroyed me. Natalie's voice broke on the words. Loving you nearly destroyed me, Christian. So yes, I'm looking for something easier. I'm looking for someone who knows how to love me back without making it feel like I'm constantly fighting for scraps of affection. The words hung between them like a sentencing, final and devastating. Christian's face crumpled almost imperceptibly, and for just a moment Natalie saw past the billionaire architect to the man underneath. The one who'd held her after her father died. The one who'd celebrated her first major design award like it was his own achievement. The one who'd looked at her like she was his entire world right up until the moment his fear of vulnerability made him push her away. Natalie. Her name was a plea. Goodbye, Christian. She turned toward her car, her hand on the door handle. Wait. His hand caught her arm gently. No force. Just a touch that sent electricity through her rain-soaked skin. The Greenwood Plaza project. You're really going for it? She looked back at him, confused by the sudden change of topic. Of course I am. It's everything I've been working toward. Then may the best design win. Something in his expression shifted, hardened into the competitive businessman she knew so well. I'll see you at the pitch meeting next week. He released her arm and stepped back, becoming the controlled, powerful Christian Bennett the world saw instead of the vulnerable man who'd briefly let his mask slip. Natalie watched him walk back toward the restaurant, his shoulders squared and his stride confident despite the rain that had soaked him through. Only when she was safely in her car, rain drumming on the roof and her hands shaking on the steering wheel, did she let herself fall apart. Seeing Christian again had ripped open every carefully stitched wound, reminded her of everything she'd lost when she'd chosen herself over their toxic dynamic. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. How's the date with Daniel? Natalie stared at the message, not sure how to explain that her perfectly pleasant date had been derailed by the appearance of a man who still held pieces of her heart she'd never managed to reclaim. Instead, she typed, complicated. Tell you tomorrow. As she drove home through rain-slicked streets, Natalie tried not to think about Christian sitting across from Victoria Ashford, tried not to imagine him smiling at someone else the way he used to smile at her. She tried not to remember the way his touch had once made her feel alive in ways she hadn't experienced before or since. Most of all, She tried not to acknowledge the truth that seeing him again had made brutally clear. 6 months of distance hadn't been enough to kill what she felt for Christian Bennett. It had only driven it underground, where it waited like a dormant seed, ready to bloom the moment he looked at her with those storm-gray eyes. The Greenwood Plaza pitch meeting was in 5 days. 5 days until she had to face him again, this time as a professional competitor instead of a former lover. 5 days to remember why she'd left, to reinforce the walls she'd built around her heart, to convince herself that moving on was possible. As lightning split the Seattle sky and thunder rolled across the water, Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was coming. Christian Bennett had walked back into her life with the force of a hurricane, and she had absolutely no idea if she was strong enough to weather what came next, but she was about to find out. The Seattle rain hadn't let up by Monday morning when Natalie pushed through the glass doors of her studio, carrying coffee that had gone cold during her distracted drive through morning traffic. Her small team was already gathered around the conference table, blueprints and digital renderings spread across every available surface, like the beautiful chaos that defined their creative process. This was her kingdom, built from nothing but talent and stubborn determination, and she refused to let Christian Bennett's reappearance shake the foundation she'd worked so hard to establish. Sophie Chen, her best friend since architecture school, and the studio's lead sustainable materials specialist, looked up from her laptop with knowing eyes. Sophie had the kind of effortless beauty that came from good genes and zero interest in conventional standards, her black hair cut in a sharp bob that framed delicate features, and a mind that could calculate load-bearing requirements faster than most computers. "You look terrible," Sophie said with the bluntness that had defined their friendship for 10 years. "Please tell me Daniel did something unforgivable and that's why you're wearing yesterday's mascara." Natalie touched her face self-consciously, realizing she'd forgotten to properly wash off her makeup before collapsing into bed at 2 in the morning. Daniel was perfect. The problem showed up after he left. Christian. Sophie's expression shifted from concern to protective fury. "That manipulative bastard actually approached you?"
"During your date?"
"With his new girlfriend in tow?" Natalie sank into her chair, setting down the cold coffee she no longer wanted. "Or date or consultant? I don't know what Victoria Ashford is to him and I don't care." "Liar." Sophie's tone was gentle now. "You care so much it's eating you alive." Before Natalie could argue, the studio door opened again and James Fletcher walked in, shaking rain from his jacket. James was their structural engineer, a 40-year-old former Marine with a gift for seeing how buildings could stand against earthquakes, wind, and time itself. He'd left a prestigious position at a corporate firm to join Natalie's startup, believing in her vision of architecture that worked with nature instead of against it. "Morning. Team?" James's gruff voice filled the space as he surveyed the organized chaos on the table. "Please tell me we're ready for Friday's pitch, because Bennett Architecture just released their preliminary designs to the press." Natalie's stomach dropped. "They did what?" James pulled up an article on his tablet, and Natalie felt her world tilt as she stared at the renderings. Christian's design for Greenwood Plaza was breathtaking, a series of interconnected structures that rose from the waterfront like organic sculptures, covered in living walls and topped with wind turbines that doubled as kinetic art installations. It was innovative, sustainable, and achingly familiar because it incorporated design elements they'd discussed together years ago, dreams they'd shared about what urban architecture could become. "Son of a bitch," Sophie breathed, looking over Natalie's shoulder. "He's using the cascading garden concept you developed for the Portland project." "It's not exactly the same," Natalie said, even as fury and betrayal burned in her chest. "He's adapted it, made it his own. He's stealing your ideas and getting press coverage for it 5 days before you present to the same client." James's tone was flat, with barely controlled anger. "That's not adaptation, Natalie. That's sabotage." Natalie forced herself to breathe, to think strategically instead of emotionally. Christian was playing chess while she'd been trying to move on with her life, and he'd just made a devastating opening move. But she hadn't survived 3 years in his shadow and 6 months building her own firm by being easy to intimidate. "He wants a war," she said quietly, her voice carrying the steel that had gotten her through countless client meetings and design reviews. "Then let's give him one. James, can you pull our structural models? I want to run new calculations on the foundation design. If we're going sustainable, we're going all the way." Solar cells integrated into the building skin, geothermal heating, rainwater reclamation systems that make his wind turbines look like window dressing. Sophie grinned, recognizing the fire that had been missing from Natalie's eyes for months. Now you're talking. I've been researching this new bioconcrete that actually absorbs carbon dioxide. What if we made the entire structure a carbon sink instead of just carbon neutral? They worked through the morning with focused intensity, refining designs and pushing boundaries. Natalie lost herself in the creative process, in the joy of problem-solving and innovation that had made her fall in love with architecture in the first place. This was who she was without Christian Bennett, brilliant and capable and whole. Her phone buzzed around noon with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk about Friday's presentation." CB. Natalie stared at the message, her finger hovering over the delete button, but curiosity and strategy won out over self-preservation. "About what?" "Your decision to leak designs to the press?" His response came quickly. That wasn't meant as an attack. The client requested preliminary concepts. Natalie's fingers flew across the screen. 5 days before the official pitch? Convenient timing. 3 dots appeared and disappeared several times before his next message came through. "Can we meet? Just to talk?" Every rational part of Natalie's brain screamed no. Meeting Christian alone was dangerous, a step backward into territory she'd fought to escape. But another part of her, the part that had loved him despite his flaws, wondered if maybe he had a legitimate explanation. She typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on, "My studio. 6 p.m. Bring your explanations." The afternoon crawled by as Natalie second-guessed her decision approximately every 15 minutes. Sophie noticed her distraction and finally pulled her aside around 4 o'clock. Concern etched across her delicate features. "You invited him here?" Sophie's voice pitched higher with disbelief. "Natalie, this is your space. Your sanctuary. Don't let him contaminate it with his mind games." "I need to know what he's planning," Natalie said, trying to convince herself as much as Sophie. "If we're going into this pitch blind while he's already manipulating the client, we'll lose before we even present. Or maybe you just want to see him again." Sophie's expression softened. "And that's okay, Nat. You loved him for 3 years. That doesn't just disappear because it's inconvenient." Natalie felt tears threaten but blinked them back. "I can't still love him, Sophie. Not after everything. Love doesn't follow logic or convenience." Sophie squeezed her hand. "But if you're going to do this, at least protect yourself. Don't let him inside your defenses. Remember why you left." By the time 6 o'clock arrived, Natalie had changed clothes twice and rearranged the studio furniture 3 times before accepting that no amount of preparation would make her ready for Christian Bennett, walking into her world. James and Sophie had left at 5:30 despite their obvious reluctance, leaving Natalie alone with her racing thoughts and the sound of rain against the windows. The knock came at exactly 6 o'clock because Christian was nothing if not punctual. Natalie took a steadying breath before opening the door to find him standing there in dark jeans and a gray Henley that somehow made him look more dangerous than any expensive suit. His hair was slightly damp from the rain and he carried 2 cups of coffee from her favorite cafe. "You remembered?" she said stupidly, staring at the cup he extended toward her. "I remember everything." "Natalie," his voice was quiet and tense. "That's part of the problem." She accepted the coffee and stepped aside to let him enter, watching as his eyes swept across the studio with obvious interest. She'd designed the space herself, all exposed brick and reclaimed wood, with drafting tables positioned to catch natural light, and a living wall of plants that purified the air while adding vibrant green life to the industrial aesthetic. "It's perfect," Christian said, running his hand along one of the drafting tables with something like reverence. "Everything I imagined your own space would be. You don't get to do that." Natalie set down her coffee with enough force to slosh liquid over the rim. "You don't get to walk in here and be charming and nostalgic. You wanted to talk about Friday's presentation, so talk." Christian turned to face her, and the raw emotion in his expression nearly undid her carefully constructed composure. "The press release wasn't my idea. The client's marketing team jumped the gun without consulting me. By the time I found out, it was already published. And the design elements that look suspiciously similar to concepts we discussed when we were together? Are you accusing me of stealing your ideas?" His voice carried an edge now, the defensive pride she remembered from their worst arguments. "I'm saying the cascading gardens, the integration of living systems into structural elements. Those were conversations we had at 2 in the morning, when we were supposed to be working on the Riverside project. Conversations that happened in your bed while you traced designs on my skin and promised we were building something together. The memory hung between them, intimate and painful. Christian's jaw tightened as he moved closer, close enough that Natalie could smell his cologne and feel the heat radiating from his body. "Every building I've designed since you left has your fingerprints on it," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "because you changed how I see architecture, how I see everything. You can't share 3 years with someone, can't create the things we created together and then expect me to just forget everything you taught me." "I taught you?" Natalie laughed bitterly. "Christian, you were the brilliant architect long before I showed up. I was just the idealistic junior designer who fell in love with her mentor. You were never just anything." Christian's hand came up to cup her cheek, the gesture so familiar it made her heart ache. "You were the one who reminded me why I became an architect in the first place. Not for the money or the recognition, but because buildings can change lives. Because design matters. Because we have a responsibility to leave the world better than we found it." Natalie knew she should step away, should maintain the professional distance she'd promised herself. But her body betrayed her, leaning into his touch like a flower toward sunlight. "Why are you really here, Christian?" "Because I made a mistake." His thumb stroked across her cheekbone and Natalie's eyes fluttered closed despite her best intentions. "The biggest mistake of my life. I let you walk away because I was terrified of how much I needed you, and every day since has been a new exercise in regretting that cowardice." "Don't." Natalie's voice was barely a whisper. "Please don't say things you don't mean." "I've never meant anything more." Christian's other hand came up to frame her face, tilting her head back until she had no choice but to meet his storm-gray eyes. "Victoria means nothing to me. That dinner Friday night was a business obligation, not a date. The only woman I want is standing right here, looking at me like I'm about to break her heart all over again. You did break my heart." Tears slipped down Natalie's cheeks despite her determination not to cry. "You made me feel like loving you was a weakness. Like needing emotional connection made me less professional, less valuable.